Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Black Carnivore live stream. So today is a little bit different. I know we normally, today would normally be our time with Arian, but he is going to come back next week. But today we have this special guest, Siobhan Huggins. So I am really excited to introduce you to her. In fact, she is what you would call an independent researcher. So, like many of us, we got interested in doing a carnivore diet and we started reading the studies and trying to understand. So that's the beginning of the journey to independent science, or independent research. But, she started that way and then just got totally into it and started reading and studying and putting together her own experiments. And essentially, that's what all of us are doing. Every time we like try a different thing or we try make a change in our diet, that's an N=1 experiment. So we are all, experimenters. We're all independent researchers of our own. But I'm really excited to have Siobhan because she has done a lot of research. Well, one with Dave Feldman on cholesterol, two on the carnivore diet as a whole. She's been following the carnivore diet for quite some time, so it'll be awesome to hear from her on that. And then finally, we're going to talk about lipedema and lymphedema, which are two conditions you probably never heard of, but in fact, you might have it because it is very common. It is underdiagnosed. I learned that I have it, and you probably do have it. And when I published an interview with Dr. Catherine Seo well, I guess that was like in May or June. I can't tell you how many like cousins and relatives and friends who don't even follow carnivore who are like, you see this thing on my, my hip or my butt. I think I have, I think I have that condition, and I'm kind of like, yeah, probably. So we're going to talk about all of that, and I'm really excited. I know the thumbnail, there was a little confusion with the thumbnail, so I'm going to change that later. But yeah, this is a great time to ask all of your scientific questions or anything you just never quite understood about carnivore. This is a good time to ask it because Siobhan is the master.
I can't guarantee I'll know all the answers, but I'll definitely do my best.
Okay, awesome. It's me, Hattie. That's that's her handle. I love it. Says I just started keto. Love you, Black Carnivore. Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And keto is a great place to start, and I love it. And some people can stay there, and that is perfect for them. So that is awesome. I am so glad that you got started. And Susie, welcome. I'm so glad you are here. So let's dive right in. So Siobhan, why don't you tell us like how you got started with like doing this independent research? Like what sparked your interest about keto, carnivore, whatever?
Yeah, so I guess I've always been a little weird. I guess a little nerd. I always liked reading and looking into various stuff, but it was, I guess, what I would call like passive learning. Like I would just read stuff and be like, okay, that's cool, but I wasn't specifically researching anything in particular or focusing on one specific topic. But what happened is I went keto for weight loss for vanity reasons. And at the time, I was around somewhere between like 220 to 240 pounds. And I'm 5'2", so that's a lot on my frame. And it was weird. It was a weird experience because I had, of course, like tried calorie restriction over and over again. And I had actually gone to talk to my mom and I was like, I'm going to do calorie restriction again. Like it's worked so well the past other times, but let's not talk about that. Like I'm going to do it again. It'll be great. And she handed me like one of those magazines you find at the like checkout type of thing. And she was like, I've been looking into keto, like not only from that, but it was something she had on hand. And she was like, I think we should do it together. And I think the reason that she had been looking into it was actually for traumatic brain injury because she had had a concussion in 2013 and it was 2016 at that point, and she was still nowhere near where she was prior to the concussion. So she had looked into a bunch of stuff, found keto, also found that it was helpful for weight loss, and it's like, okay, maybe this would be a healthier option for both of us. So I was kind of skeptical at first because of the whole magazine from checkout aisle thing. But I did end up
What are you
looking into it
talking about?
online.
Women's Wear Daily is an excellent resource when you are looking for health information or even news about the world. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it was wonderful. But I wanted to, trust but verify. So I looked into it online and I found that there was actually some research about ketogenic diets for weight loss and appetite control and that type of stuff. So it was like, okay. And my way of thinking, like, I'm very much a rule follower. Like, if I set out to do something, I'm going to do that. And so I decided I would do keto for 2 months, really strict, no cheating, like following everything below 20 grams every single day. And if it worked, then I would just stick with it because obviously can't go back to what I was doing. I had gone through that cycle way too many times. And I did do that. And I found that for one, I didn't really miss carbs like bread, potatoes, is whatever. And I was enjoying the food that I was eating pretty much to the same extent anyway. And I did lose weight over the 2 months. I lost something like 20 pounds. So I was like, okay, that's cool. But at the 2 month mark, something else happened that I didn't expect and couldn't have predicted. And if you told me it was going to happen, I'd be like, okay, you're full of it, obviously. And what happened is I was standing in a parking lot. I think it was it was 2 months in, so it would have been winter. And I had this weird feeling and I didn't know what it was. And I was thinking about it and I realized that I was content with my life and happy with my family, appreciative of my friends, like feeling good about things in general. And that was weird for me because I had had chronic depression since I was somewhere around 9 or 11 years old is when it became full-fledged. So for the first time since I could remember, since I was a child, basically, I was actually not depressed at all. I was like, okay. And the only thing I had changed, I mean, sure, I had lost weight, but I had done that a lot of times before and it hadn't had this effect. So it's like, this must be something from the diet. So now I really do have to stick with it because I don't want to go back to feeling how I did before. And so that was basically the turning point for me where I was like, okay, this is a forever thing. Like, it's working. And to be fair, there was like still a long period of time where I was talking to my boyfriend and I was like, okay, I'm losing weight, but like, what if what happens when I gain it all back? Like, you've seen a thinner me now, like, are you going to be disappointed? He was like, no, I liked you before, I like you now. You seem happier. That's what I care about. But it was a weird sensation because it was like good things were happening, but at the same time, I was like looking at my watch, like, okay, anytime now. And I'm sure that's familiar to a lot of people. But eventually I ended up connecting with the community as well. At the time I was working in IT at a help desk and doing some scripting work and stuff like that. So I was looking for podcasts to listen to and I was like, okay, keto podcasts. I want to learn more about this. Something interesting is clearly going on. And then I found the Two Keto Dudes podcast, joined their Facebook group and eventually their forum. And that was actually my first connection with the research because on the forums and in the Facebook group, people would ask questions of like, what impact does stevia have on insulin or whatever? And I would go onto PubMed, try and find papers on it, read through them, and then explain it back. Like, okay, I think this is what this is saying. I think this is what they found. So basically just trying to help answer people's questions because they were interesting questions. It's like, oh yeah, I do wonder about that. And then I ended up volunteering to help out at Keto Fest. So I was on the staff of the first Keto Fest, and that was in summer of 2017. So this is like boom, 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 like one right after the other. And that was a lot of fun for me. And I got introduced to a lot of people and I got to meet people I had been talking to in person for the first time as well. So that's where I first met Dave in person and bugged him incessantly. Every single time there was an open seat next to him, I was sitting down and being like, okay, tell me about HDL. Tell me about LDL. What about this? You said this earlier. What about this? It was also where I first met Amber, who I now live with. So Amber O'Hearn is like the mega queen of carnivores. And I was really intimidated by her at first. I didn't really start communicating with her until after that point. So I was like just going up and asking like, what do you eat? But that is also actually what got me into carnivore, because her talk been about the unique adaptation of humans to ketosis and running off of fat and as carnivores, and how we can get all these benefits from it and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, well, if I only need to eat the vegetables that I want, then I'll do that. And it just like slowly started tapering off, until eventually in October of that year, I decided to do a hard switch onto carnivore, as a bit of an experiment. And I intended to only do it for a month, and then I would go back to what I was doing. But I ended up losing additional weight and feeling even better, having more energy. My skin and hair all got better as well. And I fell into that carnivore trap of you try it out and then you're stuck. It's like, oh, well, I guess I'm doing this now. So yeah, I've been carnivore for, I don't know what the math on that is, like almost 5 years, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Keto for over 6 years now. So it
Mm-hmm.
was a thing. But the connection with Dave, like the stuff that he was talking about, he was
So
talking about
wait,
it.
before we go further, so I just want to make sure everybody, well, let's recap. This, of course, is
Yeah, because
Siobhan
it's utter
Huggins.
chaos.
Yeah. So this is Siobhan Huggins, who is an independent researcher, and she has been in the keto carnivore, well, keto, low carb keto carnivore space for quite some time, doing a lot of research and, just asking like really important questions, I think, about the diet. So she's been really awesome, and she's talking about Dave Feldman, who has the blog, The Cholesterol Code. So I think that that is a great place. Anytime anybody has a question about cholesterol, I always tell them to go there first, because there is a pinned post that's really designed to kind of break down the whole cholesterol question as simply as possible. So I encourage you all, if you have not checked out that website, that you, or the blog, that you go there and you check it out. But he continues to do research on cholesterol, which is super, super important, to help us understand like the relationship of cholesterol in in a low carb environment, and what it all means. Okay, so let's dive right back in. I'm sorry, Sean. Keep going.
Yeah, no worries. I always talk about Dave like everybody knows who he is, because I feel like they should.
They
But yeah,
should, they
so it
should, but
was,
not everybody does. Some people are new, so that's okay.
yeah, understandably, he's like a
Hmm.
celebrity in my mind as much as
Hmm.
he is a friend. Yeah, so it was really there where I started doing focused research. Like it wasn't just passively looking at whatever people brought up, it was actually looking into a singular topic with a lot of focus. And that was because, like, the way Dave talked about it, it was such a fascinating way to think about things in terms of systems and engineering. And he talked about object oriented programming. And I was already working in that space, and my dad also does. And so growing up, I would often have conversations with him about object oriented programming and systems and how things connect and all that type of stuff. So it resonated with me in that vein. And the other thing is, he would bring up things like, oh yeah, maybe LDL is like used in the immune system, but I don't know. And it's like I already could tell from that point, like this guy is already so busy with what he's focusing on. If I wait for him to find the answer about that, I'm going to be waiting years. And so I just decided to start looking into it myself. And I ended up asking him for like, what do you recommend starting out with to learn this stuff? And he was like, oh, I recommend reading my Simple series, which is like a little comic he put together, a 2-part comic. And I was like, I already read that. What's the next thing? And so I started reading lipidology textbooks on the bus back home from Connecticut. And it's
As
like,
one
I want to learn more
does,
about this.
as one
Yeah.
does when you're taking a long commute, just sure, take along a, big, heavy biochem textbook and read.
Yeah, it was an ebook, so that might make it slightly better.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so I just started researching into things, and like Dave talks about how like cholesterol metabolism was the gateway for him into energy metabolism. For me, it was the gateway into the immune system and inflammation and insulin resistance and all of this stuff and how connected all of them are to each other. Because once you start learning about lipidology, you do come across the immune system aspect in some of these papers and how it participates in those responses. And some papers even say it should be considered part of the innate immune response, which is a big deal. um, but then I started looking into other aspects of it, like, okay, what are these immune cells? Like, what do they do? What's their function? Oh, like there's all of these causes of insulin resistance. Like there would be these periods of like there's smoking and there's oxidation and like all this stuff can make insulin resistance worse. And it's like, okay, why is that? Why are ketogenic diets helping? So it just like opened this
Mhm.
big door for me of all these fascinating topics that I could play with and explore and try to understand a little bit better. And I can be a little bit obsessive. So it was just like a kid in a candy store or a carnivore in a butcher shop type of experience.
Mhm. Well, I think the first thing that I came across that you had done was looking at the difference between pork versus beef when you're, doing a carnivore diet. And at the time, there was like a raging argument about whether, one should have beef or pork, or whether you can live only on pork. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or
Yeah,
does it
so
matter?
I ended up doing that because there is so much controversy surrounding pork and chicken on carnivore diets. And it annoyed me personally because for the first year of carnivore for me, I was exclusively living off of pork and cream cheese. And I had no taste for beef. Like, I wanted nothing to do with it. And I just wanted pork. That's what I craved. So that's what I was eating. And I kind of grew up, like, came of age in this keto atmosphere of don't eat things you don't like, eat what you do enjoy, eat what you crave, like, and if it's something that's not keto, figure out why you're having that craving and try and help with that. So I was doing the same thing with carnivore, and I would get like some responses that were like, but there's so much PUFA in that, like it's not good for you. So I was finally just like, fine, I'll do a comparison between the two. I don't even remember how long it was at this point. I think it was like 2 weeks each or something like that. Maybe it might have been a week each. But it was stock standard, just pork from the market, like the cheapest stuff you could possibly find, pork chops, whatever. And then I did another one that was pastured pork, and then another that was just regular old beef, like again, probably grain finished, whatever, and then grass finished beef. And like
So wait,
honestly,
did you do
from
2 weeks
that,
on each one of those? This was like a 10
I
week
think
experiment?
no, it couldn't have been that long. It must have been 1 week on each.
Okay.
Um, because it wasn't like the longest experiment I've done, I think, was 8 weeks, including the baselines, because it gets
Mhm.
really
Yeah.
mentally tedious.
Yeah.
But I basically just wanted a quick check, and I was coming from a place of eating a bunch of pork. So that was the extended baseline, and then I'd be moving on to beef. And it's like, do I lose more weight? Am I less hungry? Does my blood work change? And honestly, the not really that much changed. Like, I mean, I was keeping fat and protein content similar between them just to make sure that didn't influence anything. And the only thing I noticed was lipoprotein little a, which is a type of cholesterol carrying molecule that's tied to heart disease, but there's a longer story beyond that, is that those levels dropped on beef. um, but the other thing is, in the research, they do mention how carnitine can decrease levels. So it could have just been that beef has
Mhm.
more carnitine, which we know that it does, and that's why. And so, other than that, it's like I don't feel any different. Like I haven't lost any more weight. Clearly, pork is not making me like fatter. So I went back to eating pork, and I was like, I don't know what to make of this, but here's the data. I guess have
Mhm.
fun.
Mhm.
So again, like now, people will still bring it up occasionally, and now I switch back and forth between pork and beef because after the first year, it's like beef started to appeal to me a little bit more, and I don't know why that is either. But now I'll switch back and forth, and I'll post something on Twitter about eating pork, and people will again come for it, and it's like, look, I have my blood work, like it's my blood work looks fine. It's within levels me and my doctor are both comfortable with. Like, it doesn't seem to be negatively impacting me. Maybe that's different for the individual, I don't know, but I tried it out on myself. I really genuinely tried to look into this and find something wrong. And for me, that just hasn't happened yet. So, like, the whole controversy, I don't know. Maybe we'll discover something in the future that it's like it'll kill you. I don't know. But I haven't found anything yet. Um, and again, it's not like I did that experiment. It's like, okay, I'm never checking into anything ever again. Like, I do keep very close eye on my health. I do blood work very regularly. I do physical measurements as well. Um, and so it's just going off of what I feel works best for me. And I can't say what that is going to be for anyone else. Now, anecdotally, I will say that most carnivores I know do tend to end up focusing on the ruminant side. And it's like, if you're doing that because you like it and that's what you crave and like you're satisfied by that, I don't see anything wrong with that either.
Mm-hmm.
I do go through several month periods of eating only beef as well. It just depends. And yeah, like the PUFA thing is kind of interesting because a lot of the anti like PUFA, like excessive PUFA type of stuff is coming from seed oils, which if you're eating that in terms of how much a standard American eats, like is a lot. But in a carnivore context, the absolute levels are going to be lower just because it's a different profile generally. Um, like the fat content is going to be different and it's a different metabolic context. So what I would really like is for actual studies to be done to see if it actually makes a difference for low carbers and carnivores. But at least in terms of myself, it doesn't seem to impact satiety, doesn't seem to impact much of anything. And yeah, so, and now like when I'm eating pork, a lot of the fat I'm eating is coming from butter anyway, butter and egg yolk and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that might also impact at this point because obviously it's not like I'm eating pork belly every day where all of the fat is coming from pork. It's just like diet is controversial. No matter what you're
Well,
doing, even within a controversial community, you have controversies. And it's like the only
yeah.
thing I can do is try to explore for myself because I have to eat the food. Nobody else does. So I have to make sure I'm eating food I enjoy and that makes me feel good and that I'm not overanalyzing things too much because that'll
Mm-hmm.
stress you out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found that when I was having like pork rinds and a lot of bacon, I that seemed to get me more inflamed. And I attributed
Pork
that
rinds in
to,
particular,
yeah.
yeah, seem to be an
Well,
issue for a lot of people.
I mean, I attributed it to the PUFAs or, the pigs that were eating a lot of like corn and soy. But who knows? Maybe that was histamines. Maybe it's, some other sort of processing, problem with processing for me
Yeah,
specifically. But
yeah,
I
exactly. And
I did
like
better
when
when I
we
took
had
those
talked
things out.
before, yeah,
Hmm.
when we had talked before, you had mentioned having a lot of food sensitivities. So, like you said, it could have been that what they were eating had impact on you. Because I know someone who has like a seafood allergy, and if the eggs they're getting is from chickens who are eating like the shells, like I don't remember what it is,
Hmm.
like oyster shells or something like that, they can start having a negative reaction to it.
Oh
So
man.
I've only heard of that once, but it was such a thing that I was like, I had never thought of that happening. That's kind of horrifying. Um,
I,
but
I
yeah,
have thought
so
about that.
I
I've been on a
always,
date with somebody where I was like, if you eat that shrimp, you know that the night's over. So to decide whether
yeah,
you really want to eat that right now.
yeah. And that's like, there are so many unknowns that
Hmm.
it's why I try to focus on individuals. Like,
Hmm.
I try not to make blanket statements or anything like that. Everyone has to explore for themselves because some people like do eat bacon, do eat pork rinds, do eat even say pork belly or something like that where it's not cured, it may not be the processing and still don't feel as well or feel unsatisfied by it or have negative
Hmm.
reactions to it. And I don't want to dismiss those accounts either because like you have to live in your own body. Like I have to live in mine, you have to live in yours. So you kind of have to make educated decisions based off of your own experience because it is such an unexplored thing. There's a lot we don't know. Like
Hmm.
the more you learn, the more it's like we have no idea about 50 trillion other things. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have some questions for you. So let's just jump in. So I see, hi, Siobhan. Did you experiment with OMAD on carnivore? I'm thinking about moving off of OMAD, but I'm worried about having multiple insulin spikes in a day if I eat more frequently. That's a good question.
Yes. Yeah, so I've done all sorts of things with intermittent fasting and extended fasting. And what I've found personally, so again, this is an individual thing, but I have heard it from others, is that when I reached my lowest weight, so I'm at a healthy weight now, OMAD just left me feeling kind of tired. Like, I feel like I couldn't get enough food. And I've heard from other women in particular on carnivore who are doing OMAD and they lose their period, they feel low energy, they're losing hair, like all of that. And if they switch to higher meal frequency, then even just 2 meals a day, like eating to satiety at each meal, those issues resolved. And for me, I do feel better. So I do specifically avoid OMAD, or at least doing OMAD too many times in a row. Like, I'll have an off day where it's like I'm traveling, I don't have time to eat multiple meals, and it's like, okay, that's fine. I just try not to make a habit of it. Especially because, like, with the way that I do carnivore, it's really, really high fat, which means it's really satiating, which is an issue because if you're only doing one meal, you may accidentally end up under eating.
Hmm.
And for other people who find like 70-30, like 30% protein carnivore really satiating, they may run into that same thing. So in that case, as with anything, switch it up and see if you feel better with more meals, especially if you're having issues of just feeling run down, tired. Because one thing that I've noticed is with carnivore, I don't get hungry in the same way, and it is a lot easier to ignore. And so the issue is, like, if I was on high carb and I was under eating, boy oh boy would I know it, because I would feel starving. But on carnivore, it's more of a feeling of fatigue, of like, oh, I could eat, or like thinking about what I could eat, and it's a lot more subtle. And maybe that's just because like you're already running on fat and then you transition more into this fasted state. There's not so much of a hard switch there. But being where I want to be already weight wise and not really wanting to lose more weight, not having much to lose beyond lipedema related fat, which we'll get into. Um, I just find I feel better with more meals.
Hmm.
Sometimes I'll do things like fat fasting, so I don't do water fasting anymore. Again, related to how much functional body fat I have at this point. And I'll do fat assisted, so I'll have something like butter and coffee 3 times a day or so. Um, and do that instead. And in terms of like the insulin spiking thing, it's like, well, first of all, you're already not on a very insulinogenic diet. So you're not eating like super high carb, like all of that. And like eating very frequently high carb in someone who's metabolically unwell could be an issue because they can have an exaggerated insulin response to that. I don't know that I've ever seen that in someone with carnivore. Granted, it hasn't been studied. But the other thing is, like, insulin does serve a function. And, like, we'll hear the same things about mTOR versus AMPK. Like, mTOR encourages growth and, like, all this. But on the other hand, too much mTOR activation is linked to cancer growth and things like that. So maybe we want to limit it as much as possible. But on the other side of things, mTOR and insulin signaling are necessary for a lot of things like protein synthesis, mTOR specifically for certain types of brain growth in terms of, I think, memory storage and things like that. So it's one of those things where it's like too much is a sign of an issue, too little can also be problematic. But in terms of multiple meals on carnivore, I don't know that I've heard people have unhealthy issues with it, unless
Hmm.
there's something else going on. So experiment and then see how you feel. Like, that's my usual stamp. Experiment,
Yeah.
see how you feel.
Well, that is the a true scientist perspective. I mean, the whole role of a scientist is to observe what you're seeing and then, make some guesses about it and to continue to observe. So, at the end of the day, what you have to do is just try it and see what happens, and then from there, you decide how you want to go forward. Now I see
Yeah.
that Truth, otherwise known as Frank, it says, once I went to 4 meals a day, I haven't fasted since. Feel so much better. Now he is, super buff, super big, works out a lot. And I remember, in the beginning, like he was trying different eating protocols, and fasting wasn't quite working for him, I think, in the right way. And I think probably because he is a, very big and muscular person. And so how do you really realistically get all of the calories and nutrients, not only, calories, but nutrients that you need in 1 meal a day?
Yeah, absolutely. I know some people who can do it, but for the way that I eat and how it impacts satiety for me, I can't manage it. Like it just doesn't work out. But if you can do it and get away with it and
Hmm.
feel good with it, I think that's also good. But I think it helps for people to be aware that there's not going to be any one way of eating that's going to fit for everybody because everybody has different health contexts, different body fat contexts, just different lifestyles, different preferences. And so some people are going to feel great on OMAD. Some people need 4 meals a day to really get where they need, especially if they're exercising a ton or have a ton of muscle mass, stuff like that. And so it just is going to depend. And maybe there are some people who try out like 2 meals a day and it's like, oh, I hate this. I don't like how it makes me feel. It makes me feel more sluggish or I gained weight or something like that. But I think for the most part with carnivore, one of the benefits is that it is an appetite regulating diet. So if you can kind of listen to the fullness and satiety signals at meal times, and even if you're splitting it up over multiple meals, it'll kind of help you not overeat because you've
Hmm.
taken out a bunch of stuff that'll dysregulate that. At least
Hmm.
for a lot of cases. Sometimes people need something more specific, even within carnivore, to achieve that. But experiment, see how you
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah. Well, so let's actually transition over to lipedema and lymphedema, because you raise an interesting point that well, fat is an organ. It's a very active one, and it does a lot in our body. So if you have fat that has problems, what does that do? How does that change, like, what's going on in your body? What are the signals that are changing because you have fat that is disabled? Now, the sun is setting, so I'm going to turn on some lights, but go ahead, keep talking, Siobhan. I'll be right back. I'm listening.
Yeah, so okay. The way that I came across lipedema was actually from a fasting experiment. So at the time, I looked more overweight. Um, and it was like, okay, so I have plenty of fat on me. Like, I can probably fast for a long time and I'll be fine and I'll have enough body fat to sustain that. And I had already done longer fasts before. Prior to that, 7 days was the longest water fast I had ever done. And it was fine. It had gone fine at the time. I had even been, I think, a little bit heavier when I did that one. But in any case, like, I could do it and it was fine. And I wanted to get some blood work and stuff from it anyway. And so I intended to do a 2 week water fast and then an additional 5 days of fat assisted fasting because I wanted to kind of compare them and see which I liked better and what differences it made and all that. And it felt weird because, for one, like I was taking measurements throughout the fast, and my arm measurements were not really changing at all, even though my waist size was going down, and even though I was losing some fat off of my thighs, it seemed disproportionate. It's like, okay, that's kind of weird. And at the end of the water fast, I was feeling really tired. Like I had to have a full night's sleep and then also a nap during the day. And even then, like I was still just tired and I wasn't up to my normal energy levels. And so I had been talking to someone who had a lot of experience with fasting. And she was like, it sounds like what you're experiencing is what people who are lean who try to do this experience. It's like, but I'm not. And it's just like, whatever. So I had posted a before and after picture on social media. And I think it was 3 separate women contacted me privately, separately. And each of them were asking the same thing, which was, hey, I looked at your before and after pictures from this fasting experiment. Um, have you considered that you might have lipedema? And I was like, I don't know what that is, so no. So I ended up looking more into it, and they pointed out some specific things, like I have a fold of fat above my knee that is kind of distinctive. I have, like, not quite a fold, but a little bulging. It's called ankle cuffing. So basically, the fat has extended, and then at the ankle, it abruptly cuts off and doesn't extend down to the feet. So it creates this little, like, cuff or bracelet looking thing. So they
I
pointed
have
that
that.
out. Like, no offense.
Yeah.
And apparently, both of those things are very distinctive to lipedema, and all 3 women were women with lipedema. And it's one of those things I recognize now, too, where it's like you learn everything you can about it, and then it's like, that woman probably also has it. So I did end up looking into it, and I talked to my doctor about it. And he originally said, like, we could get you a diagnosis, like I could send you to a specialist, but I don't know that there's much that you can do about it. And I was like, well, I want the diagnosis on the record because I already know I'm going to be digging into this, and I want to be sure I know what I'm dealing with so that I can learn as much about what is applicable to me. And
Hmm.
so he gave me a referral to a doctor in California, who, it was very weird because when he originally gave the referral, I didn't recognize her name, but upon reading a bunch of the research, I was like, she's the author on a bunch of these papers that I really like. And, so it was funny going into that appointment because I was like, hi, love your work, read all your papers, fantastic, love it. I have a bunch of questions. And so, like, she was doing all these measurements and stuff and, like, using the calipers and all of that. And I was like, so do you think it's hypoxia in the fat? Just like answering these weird questions. But now, like, knowing the lipedema community better, she may have run into that before. She did say she'd never had someone say, like, big fan when they came in, but I think asking questions is pretty common.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I did that, and then I came across a paper that was talking about ketogenic diets as a potential intervention for lipedema, which is, I think, the exact title. And I was like, oh, jackpot. Have I potentially been treating this whole time and didn't even realize? So I read through the paper, and they had a bunch of proposed mechanisms like decreased inflammation, decreased swelling, um, and recommendations as well, like avoiding sweeteners at first, avoiding nut flours. And it's like, oh, that's pretty smart because, like, nuts are a common issue and sweeteners are kind of variable in terms of impact. So that makes sense. And I had learned something from Twitter many years ago, which is that if you want, you can just email researchers because there's, like, a corresponding author, and you could just email them questions if you want to, and they'll often answer them. So I reached out and I was asking a ton of these questions, and it was Catherine who responded. And she said I should really connect you with Leslie because she'd be better able to answer these questions, basically. And the level of detail that I was asking about. Because I was asking about stuff like, so there are nodules in lipedema. Like, what is the composition of those? What are they made of? Like, what is that? Why does that happen? So I ended up talking to Leslin, and then I also got connected with them around the same time by Amber, actually, because they wanted someone to do a presentation on lipedema and carnivore. And so Amber was kind of like, talk to Siobhan. And it was very weird because I was still in the process of learning about it, and it's like, okay, I'll do a presentation about what I understand so far, but I don't know that I'll be saying anything all that interesting or new. But sometimes restating from a different perspective can help people, so it would have turned out fine either way. So I ended up connecting with them. So, stepping back, people were probably like, WTF is lipedema?
Yeah.
So,
Can you give the high level explanation of what is lipedema and
yes.
lymphedema, and then we can go in more
Yeah,
detail?
continue on. So, lipedema is a lymphatic and fat disorder, and it causes a cluster of symptoms, and some of them quite distinctive, some of them are shared that with other conditions. And one of them is disproportionate fat growth, especially on the lower body. And that fat growth, if lymphedema is not also occurring in the person, which can happen, it won't affect the feet or hands. So that's what's causing the cuffing that happens. And so lower body can be affected. It can be in different areas too. So I'm hip to ankle, but someone else could be only the hips and buttocks, or down to the knee only. So their calves may not be affected. Arms can be affected in some, but not others. So it's very variable. So not everyone with lipedema will look exactly the same. So if you look at pictures of me and it's like, well, I don't look exactly like that, but you have the other distinctive symptoms, is still worth thinking about. So the other thing is it causes swelling. There was a paper that just came out this year that said that yes, lipedema does come with edema even at the very early stages, which was the topic of debate for a little while. And basically that means you have too much fluid, either too much fluid being released into the lower body or not enough being cleared out, or both. And it looks like at the start, there's too much fluid going in because the blood vessels are very leaky, and then the lymphatics are struggling to remove all of that. So it's affecting on both ends. So you have the swelling, and that, so there's something special about the swelling also, which is that it's something called non-pitting edema, which basically means like you press into the area that's affected and it should immediately refill with fluid. And something like lymphedema, if you press, it'll leave a dent, which is pitting edema. So it's a way to differentiate them. So there's that. So
I don't
swelling,
have pitting edema, but I definitely,
everyone just
definitely have
reached
the
out
other
and looked at
kind.
their leg right now. Yeah, and it's important to note also that you can have lipedema and lymphedema. So having pitting edema doesn't necessarily rule it out. So swelling, disproportionate fat growth. The other thing that is super indicative also is these nodules that are in the fat. So when palpating the fat, you can do like that, or you can do the rolling type of thing. And if you felt it before, you'll start like feeling other people and being like, oh. So healthy fat, like I compared
Well,
against Amber.
I didn't notice anything was different. So when I was at Low Carb USA, Dr. Leslyn Keith was
Yes.
like massaging me, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I feel it." And I was
Yeah.
like,
And
"But
that's where
isn't
it's
this
really
what it feels
helpful.
like for everyone?" And she was like,
No,
"No."
and I thought the
She's like,
same
"Let me
thing.
find, yeah, let me find
Let me find
somebody,
a
let
regular
me find
person with healthy
another."
fat here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
and
no,
I thought the same thing because I was reading up about lipedema and I was feeling my arm and I was like, feels like an arm. It's not like I go around like feeling other people all the time. I do
right.
now, but so I was like, Amber, can I feel your arm? She's like, yeah, sure. And we compared. It's like, oh, I get it. Like healthy fat is kind of like this firm texture. It's like smooth, like the fat on a pork chop, because it is fat, just like we have. So similar texture. And it's held like it's not all loose and like it doesn't feel all like spongy or boggy. It's
See,
like,
mine
okay,
feels
I get it.
definitely feels grainy. Like I can feel
Yeah,
like there's grains in it. So those
yeah.
grains are actually scar tissue, correct?
It is. So it's little pockets of fat that have been coated in scar tissue. So those are called nodules. And as far as I can tell, those are extremely distinctive of lipedema. Because when I was originally looking into it, I was like, what are the symptoms that pop up in other places? What are the symptoms that are exclusive to this? Because if you look for the specific symptoms that are only showing up in lipedema, you can end up learning a lot about the potential origins of what exactly is going wrong, of potential things you may want to focus on in terms of treatment, things like that. So the nodules seem to be very distinctive, and they can range anywhere from the size of little grains of rice all the way up to apple, plum, walnut. And typically it's in the later stages that they start getting bigger. And I think what is actually happening is the little ones are like fusing together to make larger clumps.
So
So that's what I was talking.
if a fat cell is coated in scar tissue, I mean, scar tissue is usually fibrous and tough. So does that mean the body no longer has access to that cell because it's coated in the scar tissue?
I suspect. And I think there's a large hint going towards that because one of the other things relating to lipedema is that the fat in lipedemic areas tends to be resistant to weight loss. So anecdotally, people do seem to have more effectiveness in losing from lipedemic areas from things like keto and carnivore and things like that, as opposed to just calorie restriction. But the issue is, like, even if you look at me, like, I didn't become stick thin from carnivore. Like, I still do have the disproportionate fat. It's just that I lost a lot of the healthy fat that there was to lose. And I'm kind of left with this scarred fat
Mm.
left over. And you
Mm-hmm.
can even feel that in the tissue. Like, if you feel my arms, things like that, it's pretty much all bumpy, all lumpy. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's just what's left over. And I think that does suggest that we do have trouble accessing it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you just think of it in terms of physical spaces, if you think of it as a system, it's like if you have this physical object that is the fat cell or a clump of fat cells, and you then coat it in this fibrous material, like you said, the scar tissue, then I mean, receptors are going to get affected. The ability to get fat out is going to be affected. Signaling may be affected. A whole bunch of things could be affected from that that may result in difficulty losing that. And there are also case studies of women with lipedema still not losing that lipedemic fat, even from things like weight loss surgery, bariatric surgery, and then also starvation. So I think it's in Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, where he has a picture of a lipedemic woman who has starved herself to emaciation. And from the waist up, it's like that is a person who is starved. Like their bones are showing, like very, very emaciated. But then from the waist down, she still looks obese. And that's an extreme. And it is also an issue with lipedema because in some cases, you can have these body image issues, and it often comes with anxiety and depression. And there's the potential for an eating disorder to develop, but it's still not going to affect those areas, which could just end up in cycling downward
Mm-hmm.
spiral.
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of the distinctive things. The wrist and ankle cuffing, which may happen if you have it down to the ankles or down to the wrist, which not everybody does. The graininess, bumpiness of the nodules in the tissue. You also have the swelling, which may get worse over the day, or it could get worse from things like heat. So you could have heat-induced edema, which I didn't realize I have, but the diagnosing physician
I
asked about
definitely
it.
do. All
Yeah, and
summer
I
long, like
said,
all
yeah,
bloated. And as soon as fall hits, it's like, oh,
yeah. And
so much
like when
slimmer.
she asked, do you get heat-induced edema? I was like, I don't know, because I try not to get too hot because I'll get nauseous. And she's like, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely yes.
Yeah.
So you can have swelling in the lower legs. That's the non-pitting version. And then, oh, another one I forgot, which is one of the major ones, is pain. It varies though, because keto can help. Other management strategies can help, like things to decrease swelling, compression gear, for example, or MLD therapies, things like that. So my pain is very minimal. It'll really only pop up as an ache or a pain if I'm very sleep deprived or if I've eaten something, usually from a restaurant that didn't agree with me. But I can put compression gear on and kind of manage it that way. But before keto, like if someone touched my arm, so it's pain and especially pain on pressure. If someone like grabbed my arm to get my attention, I would be like yanking it away, being like, ow. And they're like, why are you overreacting?
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the pain is another important thing because it's one of the major factors that can impact quality of life in people with lipedema. Like, this is a chronic pain condition, and luckily that pain can be managed. But imagine for someone who has not been diagnosed, doesn't know where it's coming from, other people don't understand it and don't even know it exists. And then they may be told you're making it up or you have
Mm-hmm.
fibromyalgia or things like that. And they're basically given nothing. It can be excruciating pain. Some There was one study where they did a survey of people with lipedema and they kind of asked them to describe it, and some people provided their own words. Tearing, stabbing, like glass is in the fat tissue, burning pain. So, like, even just from the words that people are using, Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is something that can be really, really severe.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, on the studies that we have of using ketogenic diets, and that includes case studies and pilot studies, pain is one of the things that majorly improves. So that's good. Like, there are things that we can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
So disproportionate fat growth, wrist or ankle cuffing, the pain, nodules, and resistance to weight loss, and I think and the swelling as well. So those are
Mm-hmm.
the kind of overview factors of what people are typically looking for when they're looking for lipedema.
Mm-hmm.
But it does also help to have someone who's familiar with it, because when I was being asked these questions, I either didn't know or thought I didn't have them because it's like, I only live in my body. I
Yeah.
don't know what's normal. It's like, do you have unusual amounts of pain? What does that mean? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Is having pain unusual? Um,
Well, I remember
so
we were
that
having the conversation when you were talking about the pain, and I'm thinking, I don't have that much pain. And then we talked about getting blood pressure and how, for me, that's like super painful. It's like really
yeah,
awful. But I
yeah.
assumed
So that's
everyone
actually
experiences that much pain with the blood pressure cuff.
yeah.
So I was like, oh, yeah, it's just sure. It's just normal.
Blood
But
pressure cuffs are
no.
still quite uncomfortable for me. I can tolerate it, but I don't like it. But again, like, you bringing that up, that's a good point. Like, even though it's not excruciating for me, I would have assumed that everyone feels really uncomfortable from that, because I
Hmm.
only have my own experience. It's not like everybody's going around, oh, I love getting blood pressure taken. It feels so comfortable for me. Like, that just
Right.
doesn't happen. So again, it's like the importance of discussing these things and making people aware. Feeling pain in your legs all the time, not normal. Feeling pain when a pet is sitting on your lap, not because their nails are digging in, just but from the weight of them, can also cause pain with lipedema. Blood pressure cuffs comes up all the time, and those can actually be trigger points where people suddenly realize that this is not normal and it's something that they
Hmm.
should look more into.
Hmm.
But it's, again, like one of those things where mental health too, it's like, well, doesn't everybody feel anxious and depressed? Isn't that kind of normal? It's like, clearly I'm just worse at coping with it. Um, and it's like, man, we should really just talk about these things.
Absolutely. So, just to clarify and to do a high level sum up. So, lipedema is a disorder of the fat cells, right? And then
Yeah,
it's
of the fat tissue
somehow
generally, because we don't know where the issue is coming from
okay.
still. We don't know what the exact cause is. I've done a couple of presentations kind of giving my thoughts, but the high level overview is, I think there may be an underlying connective tissue problem
Uh-huh.
that may be resulting in these issues. There's links to other disorders where that may make sense, but it's not
Hmm.
confirmed, and it's just my own thoughts on the topic, so I don't know if it's true yet.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And
so
then
fat cell or
lymphedema, and then lymphedema is related how?
So lymphedema can actually develop in the later stages of lipedema if the disorder is not well managed, and that tends to be a lot of people with lipedema. And basically, it is a disorder of the lymphatic system, and it causes swelling because the lymphatics are not working properly. And the issue with that is that it can then start causing fibrosis of the skin, further fibrosis of the lymphatic vessels. So you can have massive amounts of swelling. And that can also cause issues because persistent swelling in the research has shown to cause fat accumulation in those areas. So you have
Mm.
this kind of doubling down effect of even more swelling, potentially even more fat gain. It can also come with issues like cellulitis and skin infections because the lymphatics are really important for the immune system as well. Um, like, if you get wounds in those areas, you could have trouble with them as well. So it's
So I
another
don't know
issue
what
on
the
top of it. It's
lymphatic
just one.
system is. Um, I mean, I've heard of lymph nodes,
Yeah.
but what is the lymphatic system? I mean, that's a cleansing system in the body, right?
Yeah. So basically, like how we have blood vessels, we also have lymphatic vessels. So the blood brings fluid in, and the fluid brings with it blood, red blood cells, nutrients, oxygen, all that type of stuff for the tissue. But then you also have fluid that then needs to be removed and either recirculated or gotten rid of. The lymphatic system will handle that aspect. So it takes up, I think, all of the excess fluid and moves it out. So pretty much like alongside all of the blood vessels, there's a little lymphatic vessel right next to it, and they work together to kind of help us not swell. Um,
Right.
but the lymphatic system does a whole ton more because it helps also remove cellular waste. So anytime you have a metabolic process going on, just like if you're using a car, it has the exhaust, you have the exhaust from those metabolic processes that needs to be taken out and disposed of.
Hmm.
And then also the lymphatic system is a big travel network for the immune system as well.
Hmm.
So it has multiple functions. It's crucial to living. So when you
Right.
have a disorder of the lymphatic system, then you can have a bunch of problems relating to that in terms of fluid clearance, in terms of potentially immune function in those areas. So that's kind of the differentiator. But
Hmm.
first, lipedema and lymphedema sound similar, and even when I'm saying it, I have to make sure to emphasize so it doesn't get confusing. And then the other aspect is they can sometimes look the same because there is some symptom overlap. So
Hmm.
lymphedema also causes swelling. It can also cause disproportionate fat growth. It doesn't typically come with pain or easy bruising, and easy bruising can come with lipedema as well. But if you have lymphedema in the lower body, for example, you could say, hey, that kind of looks like lipedema, maybe. And on the flip side, a lot of people with lipedema are misdiagnosed as having lymphedema because they do have the symptom overlap. And it's also not uncommon for people with lipedema to get diagnosed by lymphatic specialists because they can kind of see both because of the overlap and misdiagnoses that can happen. Um, so yeah, I kind of think of them like sister conditions in a way because they do have some overlap, like I said, but they're definitely different. And one of the other things is lymphedema is often not symmetrical, and it can be caused by things like if you have lymph node removal for breast cancer treatment, for example, you may develop lymphedema in the arm on the side where you had that removal done. And it's only affecting that one arm, so it's not both legs. And the other thing is, even if you say had it in both arms or both legs, it can be asymmetrical as well. And lipedema tends to be symmetrical and bilateral, so on both sides.
Hmm. Okay. And Esther asks about have either of us utilized rebounding to help with the issues with the lymphatic system? So, if you don't already have lymphedema, do we have an issue with the lymphatic system? If we just have lipedema,
Yeah,
and
so it
would those things help?
seems Yeah, so it seems like there is issues with edema even in early stages of lipedema. So at a certain point, you could eventually develop lymphedema as well on top of the lipedema. But there has been a lot of stuff in terms of things that help remove fluid from the area, helping with things like the easy bruising, the pain, fatigue, things like that. And then also, because that fluid sitting there may be encouraging fat growth, we may not want that to sit there. So, encouraging it back out, however we can in a healthy way, may be beneficial for long term care as well. Just to help with like slowing progression or preventing progression and things like that. So
Hmm.
in terms of rebounding, I haven't ever done it personally, but I have heard a lot of women with lipedema who did find it really useful. I'm not sure of the reasoning behind it, if it's just like the impact. But I have heard some women say that it's kind of helped with the fibrosis in the tissue as well,
Hmm.
and then overall symptoms. So that's kind of interesting. The main things that I've played with are compression, but I also want to look into things like manual lymphatic drainage, lymphatic massage, a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah. So I have heard it is helpful for a lot of people.
Okay. So, just for those of you who are not familiar, apparently, as I've started to do some research, there are various types of therapies that essentially try to push the fluid through your body. So if your body's not able to, to expel that fluid, the way it's supposed to, like you're basically having another human person manually pushing that fluid through your limbs to get it to release. So, so these are, various therapies that essentially do that.
Yeah, basically, if you look into lymphatic therapies, you'll find a bunch of them. Leslyn Keith has a
Mm,
book called The Lymphatic Code where she goes through a whole ton of them.
mhm,
And I found that book really interesting because I can apply a lot of it to lipedema as well, because there is that edema aspect. So things like compression gear, and the compression gear works by it squeezes tighter at the end of the limb, so either the wrist or the ankle, and then that graduates to less compression going up, so it's kind of squishing it up and out, so it can exit out and be recirculated or gotten rid of. And then even things like pool exercises, because there's more pressure in the deeper water and then less going up, same sort of thing. So kind of doing exercises like that can sometimes help. There are breathing exercises as well, which I've done like twice because it was part of like a webinar thing I was at. And then also activity, because one of the other things is, so the blood vessels work by the heart pumping the blood, but the lymphatic vessels actually work through a combination of pressure gradients. So the fluid enters the tissue, the pressure increases from that, and then it helps push it out. And then also muscle contractions. So activity can also help, even if it's not like super heavy duty exercising, like even walking or pool exercises or yoga or things like that, can also help remove some of that fluid because you're increasing the amount of muscle contractions, and that'll help the lymphatic vessels take up that extra fluid.
mhm. Okay. So we do have, let's see, a couple of questions. Johnny G wants you to look at my cholesterol numbers while I have you on the line. I don't know if that's all that interesting, but we could come back
I
to
mean,
that.
I'm super curious about like the lipid panels of people with lipedema because,
Hmm.
like, going from Dave's work, he published a paper on the lipid energy model, and he's been doing years and years of work into that. So, kind of, I'm wondering what is normal for women with lipedema who are on ketogenic and carnivorous diets,
Hmm.
and see like if that fat physiology impacts in any sort of way. But that's like a whole research project. Like, I know what my numbers look like, but that's not particularly helpful.
Hmm. Well, I would love to be part of something like that. I'm happy to help. Um, okay, so it's me, Hattie. Well, she says so. Ketosis will burn up that fat, guaranteed. I think that what we've talked about suggests that not necessarily. It will
Yeah, because the
burn up
fat
the
is kind of
healthy
walled
fat,
off.
but not necessarily the unhealthy fat.
Yeah, so the diseased tissue, if it is kind of walled off by that scar tissue, it may just be inaccessible in physical terms, and
Hmm.
signaling and other stuff may be impacted. We don't fully understand why it is resistant, but I would hedge a bet the scar tissue may be playing in there. And just
Yeah.
like a joint becoming scarred or any other organ becoming scarred, it can impact its function. Um,
So
so.
I don't know if Hattie is familiar with like keloids, but like that's a kind of scar where, the scar builds on top of scar and on top of scar, and you can develop these like huge, nodules or, just a ton of scar tissue. And I'm imagining that if you have fat cells that are diseased, problematic, or have something going on with them, and they're building that scar tissue on top of them, like you could get to the point where it is impossible to penetrate to the inside of that cell.
Yeah, and there are quite a lot of women who've gone keto for lipedema, and while they do see a lot of improvements, and the improvements are worth highlighting and putting a spotlight on and
Hmm.
emphasizing as much as possible because lipedema is notoriously difficult to deal with. Um, Typically, I don't see people who develop this normal body type after this. They typically do still have the lipedema body type, like I do, but their symptoms are vastly reduced and minimized. Some
Hmm.
people do kind of achieve like a non disproportionate body type, but that may have just been because of the level of scar tissue they had developed was minimal in the first place, or it hadn't gotten that bad. But we don't know. So maybe there is scar reversal that's
Well,
happening, but
why
it
doesn't
doesn't
it
seem to be
yeah.
widespread.
Well, why doesn't it, progress in some people? I mean, I'm 51 years old. I've eaten poorly most of my life. I mean, I started keto in 2015, but like some women, are nearly immobilized by the time they're in their 30s. And yet, I was well into my 40s and still, I might not even have known if somebody hadn't said to me something about lipedema. So why do some people progress and other people not?
So we don't know. Again, like lipedema was only named in the 1940s, and it sounds like a long time ago, but in terms, especially comparing to like heart disease and diabetes, it's not a long time. So we're very much in like the boon of learning about it. But I would hedge a bet that there's probably multiple things playing in. So it seems like there might be a genetic link. So it seems to run in families. If one person has it, it's very common for a family member, like a direct family member, to also have it. And maybe that's relating to the connective tissue disorder aspect that might be at play. Not sure. Another aspect is it's mostly, almost entirely women. So there may also be a hormonal component, and that's supported by common triggers being puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. But that could also be because those are periods of a lot of stress because you're growing or shifting to this different metabolic state, hormonal state rather. But I think one component, and I think this plays into why ketogenic diets seem to help, is metabolic health impacting. Um, and so that doesn't necessarily mean if you're metabolically unhealthy, everyone will progress at exactly the same rate. Just like some people develop diabetes very early and some people develop diabetes much later in life. I think it depends on the environmental context of the person and how well their body is coping with that. So that could come in from things like how metabolically ill they are, how nutritious the food that they're eating overall is, because, if you're having the stress on the system, maybe having nutritious food coming in may help to some extent. The level of inflammation that they're necessitating from overall lifestyle and things like that. And then there may be additional things within that. Like, ketogenic diets seem to be impacting on progression to some extent. Like, it hasn't been formally studied over the long term, but at least anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of symptom improvement in people saying that they seem to be progressing slower. So ketones could be playing into that aspect, but in terms of like previous lifestyle, I would guess it's just a combination of the environment that that person is in. So nutrient environment, metabolic health environment, potentially connective tissue health environment, like all of that coming together and kind of translating into how far they're progressing. And other things like activity could also play into. So let's say, they're eating fairly healthy, like maybe not super stellar, but better than a lot of people. They're fairly active, so they're getting more of those muscle contractions, helping with the edema. Maybe they are a swimmer, so they're getting that pressure gradient that way as well, unintentionally. Then that could translate very differently from someone who's more on the sedentary side, very
Mm.
metabolically ill, not eating very well, very nutrient poor diet. So that's speculation. Disclaimer, disclaimer. Very much speculation, but that is kind of where my thinking has gone in terms of how progression is going. And then there could be other things as well, because if metabolic health is playing in and overall health is playing in, then you could have other environmental factors like smoking, like toxin exposure, like mold
I
exposure, heavy metal
smoked, I
exposure.
drank. I'm sure I was surrounded by lead, probably ate it as a kid. So,
Eating paint chips or something. But yeah, so
inhaling steel dust in this New York
yeah,
City
I think it's
subways.
a similar question as to like why can I eat a bagel and gain 10 pounds and another person can eat a bagel and they're stick thin and seem to remain fairly healthy? I think it's a combination of genetics and
Mm,
environment and hormonal, like all of those things playing together. And bodies
gotcha.
are can be very good at coping if they have
Mhm.
like the right environmental setup. So maybe that's playing in. But I would
Mhm.
love to look at people who have, very minimal progression in the 30s, 40s, 50s and see, like, look over their prior history or follow them at an early diagnosis and see like how fast they're progressing versus what they're doing, and see if we can figure out, because there probably are multiple things going into it, but if there are commonalities that we could pull out and say, hey, it turns out this is actually really important, I think that would
Mhm.
be both fascinating and helpful.
Mhm. Okay. Now, Nzinga says, I wonder if nattokinase, Sarah
Nanokinase,
Pep,
maybe?
yeah, serapeptase, or
Serapeptase, yeah.
pro, yeah, or some other kind of
Yeah,
proteolytic
basically
enzyme.
proteases.
You're talking about.
Basically things that take proteins and break them down. So
Mhm.
enzymes or proteases. And I have heard speculation on that front. I'm really curious about them as well, because basically the idea is things that will help break down the scar tissue. So turn the proteins that make up the scar tissue into amino acids, and then those can be cleared out. So essentially breaking it down and clearing it out. Um, Good question. Haven't seen like long-term studies on it. And the other thing is that may also depend on the overall environment. So would that be as effective in, say, a person who's not managing it very well, where it may just rescar over, versus someone who's managing the condition very well and the scar tissue may not reoccur because they're not progressing as much. Um,
Yeah.
so I think it's interesting, and I may or may not be experimenting with some of that myself, but nothing definitive. I've heard kind of mixed. Sometimes say like, yes, it helps soften my fibrosis. Other people said no, it didn't really do anything.
Well, Nzinga, great question. Sounds like you have some special knowledge here that you were, aware of those particular therapies. Is
Yeah,
there
I do
any
see them
other
brought up.
way? Oh, okay. Is there any other way to break up scar tissue? I mean, I've gone to the physical therapist and he's like, yeah, you got some scar tissue in here from when you fell down, never did anything. So you got to massage it really hard and try to break up that scar tissue. Is there any other way to break up scar tissue?
Yeah, and again, I've heard it mixed. Some people say like some things are very helpful. Some people say not so much. May depend on the person or how they're doing it or what therapy it is, where they're at in their own management, that type of stuff. But for example, there are like manual massage, like you mentioned, although you would want to probably get someone who specializes in lipedema, just because you don't want to cause more damage on top if they're not familiar with kind of how to handle it. Gua sha is another one, so that's tool assisted, basically a scraping tool. So you like press the scar tissue in between the tool and then your bone and muscle in between to help kind of agitate it and help break it down. Um, Other tool assisted things like mechanical tools, like really heavy vibration. I've heard some people say the rebounding helps soften up the scar tissue that they had. And I don't think there's like a magic bullet that's been discovered. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. But there are a lot of things that people try, and it's another one of those things. Like with lipedema, especially, it's a lot of experiment, see how it works. So I've done a couple of those. I tried scraping, and as far as I could tell, it didn't really do that much. It did
Hmm.
bruise my arms,
Hmm.
but beyond that, like I tried it for a month or two and just wasn't seeing much. So I kind
Hmm.
of, well, that was not a failed
Hmm.
experiment because it did help me learn about myself, but something that just didn't work how I wanted, and I moved on to the next thing.
Hmm. Now I'm thinking about it. I had a friend who had invented this kind of, those rolly type of things that, if you have like, you work out and then you roll on it afterwards to loosen up your muscles and stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
So
like the
he,
foam
he
rollers and stuff.
right. So he made one with these like nodules and bumps on it. So you get this like massage. So he wanted me to try it because I was helping him out with some of the marketing stuff. So I was supposed to try it and, whatever. And I was like, God, this really hurts, whatever. Next day I come back. I've got like, I look like a leopard. I mean, was like bruised all up and down my back. And he was like, what's wrong with you? That's not normal. And I was like, you're a torture rack. That's what did this. Now I
Yeah,
guess I
so I
get
got the same
why.
thing. Yeah, I got the same thing on my arms. I knew ahead of time that that was likely, though, um, because I had talked to people who had done it before and lymphatic specialists and stuff like that. And they were like, yeah, if you do that with lipedema, like, you probably will bruise. And, like, I showed them, like, pictures and did, like, a consultation and everything. Like, is this a normal amount of bruising? And it's like, yeah. It's like, okay, good to know. But it is one of those things where you would probably want to work with someone who's familiar with it, because there is like
Hmm.
a normal amount of bruising versus, oh, that's not good. You did that way
Yeah,
too hard.
yeah. So we have been on quite some time, but I do have one last question. So to go back to fasting, why was fasting a challenge for you as as someone with lipedema? And what is for someone with lipedema, what is a better approach to fasting and to
Yeah,
losing weight?
so I think it comes back to the fat tissue that is scarred is not working properly. So I might have looked quite overweight at the time, or moderately overweight. I don't know. People can come up with their own interpretation of that. But it's very possible that a lot of the fat that I had was not actually functional and I couldn't access it for energy. So when I had gone in with my diagnosis,
So
one of the
for all
things that she
intents and
did,
purposes, your body
I
thought you're
was
thin.
lean.
You know,
Yes.
we don't have
And
any extra
so,
fat.
yeah, I now refer to it as functionally lean. So, as far as my body was concerned, I did not have a lot of fat tissue to access and use. And I think that can pop up in situations other than lipedema, just speculatively. But so when I went in for that lipedema diagnosis, she did something I thought was really cool, which is she took calipers to measure the amount of fat. And she did it in areas where I didn't have lipedemic tissue. So on my back, on the front of my thighs, and she gave me an estimate of how much healthy fat she thought I had from that, and she said around 25% body fat, which in a female is like almost athletic. I think it's like, oh, well, no wonder I didn't feel good. Because like if you took a woman with like 25% body fat and put her on a 2 week fast, I doubt she would feel fantastic. I mean, maybe she would. I mean, good for her, but I definitely didn't. So I think that may have played in, especially with the person I had been talking to who was experienced with fasting said this sounds like someone who is lean trying to fast for too long. And
Mm.
on the other hand, like I do know a lot of women with lipedema who love fasting, love intermittent fasting, extended fasting, periodic fasting, like all of that. And I think the main thing that I would kind of want in people who are playing with that, who know that they have lipedema or suspect, is just pay attention to how you're feeling. So when I was heavier and had more healthy functional fat, in all likelihood, because it came off, when I fasted, I felt completely normal. I had normal energy levels. I could do normal exercises and all that. I was sleeping well, so there was no insomnia or extra need for sleep. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thinking about food, um, like all of that. And I think that's what fasting is supposed to look like. So it's like if you are getting fatigue, needing extra sleep, having insomnia, not able to do normal activity, thinking about food, like getting hungrier during the fast or over the course of the fast. Like it's supposed to be like, oh, day one or day two is the worst, and then it gets easier. But if it's not, and it just keeps getting worse, and you're continuing to get more hungry, maybe listen to that and just break it and say, okay, maybe that's not for me. And then the thing that I opted to do is just do the fat assisted fasting, so pure fat to supply some extra energy if my body can't access it from what I have. And then I can still get some of the benefits that I wanted from that, which would be like higher ketones, lower glucose, maybe autophagy going on, although we don't have like all the information on that either. And like I just feel nice doing that, and I don't have to worry about food or grocery shopping for like 3 days. um, but the other thing is like if I'm mentally, psychologically feeling resistant to the fast, I just stop. If I'm not feeling well, I just stop. If
Hmm.
I'm feeling overly tired, just stop. If I'm feeling overly stressed, I just stop. Like so it's very much paying attention to like, am I in a good state to fast right now and am I handling it well? So like I'm not a fasting expert or anything like
Why
that.
are you fasting?
So for me, I did want the higher ketones for a little bit just to see if it would help with some things. And I also am cheap. So it's like, oh, I don't want to buy food for 3 days. I'll just fast. And sometimes I just feel like it. I don't know why, but sometimes I'll get like, oh, I really want to fast. And so I'll listen to that as well on the flip side.
Hmm.
I don't think it's anything that's really necessary for me. And there are long periods of months and months and months where I just don't feel like it and I won't do it. Um, yeah. And then when I was doing it, like, I went through a period of doing it for like 3 days of fat fasting once a week. And I found that my body composition actually improved from that. So it's like just experimenting and found I liked what I got out of it.
Hmm. Okay. And it's me, Hattie asks, where does the scar tissue come from? Which is a great question because I don't know either.
Yeah, so I did this whole presentation because it's a really good question. Because, like, we always think of scars like they happen, but it's like, but why? Like, why do
Hmm.
they happen? So, as far as I can tell, the commonality between things scarring is either a really big injury has happened, like, let's say you fall and get, like, impaled on something. You take that out, you're otherwise fine. It's very likely that will scar just because it's not safe to have an open wound for an extended period of time. So it's like, okay, let's just pave over this really quick. The other thing is persistent injury, and I kind of think of that like calluses that can develop. So they kind of build up to protect against irritation that's happening. Um, and then there's also specific signals that can result in it, even specifically in fat tissue, which seems more like the callousing type because it seems it might be reversible in that circumstance. And you typically see it in like obesity, is hypoxia in the fat tissue. So not enough oxygen can set off signals that may trigger fibrosis in the fat. But that is, like I said, it seems like that happens more in obesity. And in that context, there's at least mouse studies that show it may be reversible. So I think it's actually a separate context from lipedema. What I guess, just in my brain, is there's some sort of injury that's happening with lipedemic fat tissue. And that injury is either enough that it's seen as a big enough problem to necessitate scarring in response, or it's persistent injury and then it scars over. Um, so the latest presentation that I did, I kind of went more into where I think that might be coming from. And that was at Keto Fest. I don't think the recording is out yet, but I think what may be happening is there may be fragile connective tissue in lipedema, and specifically in the fat. So when that excess fluid is coming in, it may be that it's tearing or something similar to that.
Mm.
Highly speculative, could be completely
Mm.
false, but it's interesting because I know we're like going on for a while, but there's another condition called Williams syndrome, not really related to lipedema at all. And it's a genetic condition where 1 out of 2 copies of about 2 dozen different genes get deleted. So they're not even mutated. It's just that those copies gone. And what's interesting is about 30% of people with Williams syndrome, both men and women, will develop this lipedema phenotype. And that is the disproportionate fat gain and then the cuffing, which is distinctive, but they don't have some of the other signs of the easy bruising or the pain. And the nodules, I don't think has been published about. But if they don't have those either, I think that would be pretty significant. And so it seems like the speculation with Williams syndrome is what's happening is that their connective tissue has become overly lax because of this defect that they have. So the fluid comes in and sits there, and then you get the fat growth happening from that fluid stasis, basically. But because they don't have the other symptoms, it's like, well, okay, here's a major difference. So I'm wondering if what's happening in lipedema is that instead of just laxity, it's like stretching like taffy and then sitting instead of being like a proper rubber band of connective tissue. It may be
Mm.
tearing or becoming damaged in some way, and then you get the scarring as the fat kind of herniates out from its supportive network and can't get what it
Mm.
needs, gets injured in. But I don't know. Doubt me, please. Don't
That's,
believe me.
I mean, that's fascinating. That's probably more than is known or talked about out there. So I really
Yeah,
appreciate the
so I
effort that you
would
put into this.
love, I would love, first of all, further research into Williams syndrome to see if they do have the nodules or not. because if they don't, I think that would support that idea that there is an issue with the connective tissue, which we do see other signs of in lipedema, blood vessel abnormalities, more laxity in later stages. So they have that increased compliance later on. And then hypermobility being more common as well, so overly flexible joints. So there are signs there may be something weird going on there. And then also stuff in the arteries related to connective tissue.
Hmm.
But like first, more looking into Williams syndrome and see what exactly the differences are. Because if you get that fat growth pattern, especially with the cuffing, which I don't think I've seen anywhere else, but not the other stuff, it's like, okay, what are the
Hmm.
differences? What are the similarities? And then
Hmm.
also just like further research into connective tissue differences in lipedema,
Hmm.
specifically looking at maybe the strength of the connective tissue in those areas or how it's
Hmm.
growing, deformities, all that. Because I would love to be proven wrong, because even if I'm wrong, it just means I've learned more, so I win either way.
Sure. Sure. All right, folks. Well, you heard it here. This was a fascinating deep dive, and I'm going to continue, over the months to talk about lipedema because, well, I don't know, maybe I haven't announced it, but I did suspect that I had this going on for me, and then over the weekend at the Low Carb USA conference, I did have a chance to talk to Dr. Leslyn Keith, and she squeezed my arm and was like, "Yes, indeed, I see lipedema in your upper arms, and yes, you have the cuffing on the lower legs. So yes, indeed, you have it on your legs." So I do intend to spend some time really kind of doing a deep dive and trying to understand more about it. And I will be continuing to share this information. And I hope that Siobhan will agree to come back in the future because she is a wealth of knowledge on any subject. And I always am impressed by and respect a curious mind that is not trying to present the answer, but just really trying to ask questions and look at what is before you. And I think that is most important. And of course, that for us who are, actively working on our health, this is the thing that we have most struggled with, going to doctors who are like, I don't even want to listen to what you're saying to me. I'm just going to tell you what I think is happening or what I feel like dealing with at the moment. And so, we've all struggled with that when it comes to the medical industry. So when you have an opportunity to deal with someone who is genuinely curious, genuinely smart, and genuinely cares about, the topic that we're discussing, it's a pleasure. So thank you, Siobhan. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me just give some additional resources, because it's very possible that some people may have seen this and went, "Oh crap, that sounds like me," because it happens every single time that I talk
Hmm.
about it, even in passing. So the Lipedema Project is a 501c3 nonprofit, and I'm on the board of that, so full disclosure there. Um, but they are focused on research and advocacy. So further looking into the science behind lipedema, ketogenic diets and lipedema, providing support and community for people with lipedema, because oftentimes it can feel very lonely and scary to, I mean, mixed feelings with diagnosis of anything, but this especially because like we're still learning about it. So having a group of other people who know exactly what you're talking about, who can offer a wealth of advice and their own experience and things like that. Like even me personally, I've found it really helpful to have that and just have a place I can go in private and talk about my grievances and what I need help with. And then also on the Keto Mojo site, I have a presentation about lipedema and why I think ketogenic diets might be helping. I'll probably need to update it 10 million times because we're learning as we go. But I think it's a cool starting place. And I have a couple slides talking about like the common symptoms and like what can be looked out for and things like that. So that might be helpful as well. And yeah, you can find me there, and I'm working with them all the time on like 10 billion different things, so it's pretty cool.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll put those links in the description box for those of you watching in the replay. And yeah, I hope that this really piqued your interest. And I know I saw Esther had asked about having fat accumulation at the inside of the top of her thighs. So I don't know if that's a typical spot for lymphedema or.
Yeah, I think like the inner thighs is pretty common. But yeah, again, if it's suspected, just check out like the common features of
Mhm.
it, and then you can take that to your doctor if they're familiar with it, or lymphatic specialists can sometimes know about it. On the Lipedema Project page, they do have
Mhm.
a provider lookup of people who may be familiar with it. You can call, double check, and then see, and kind of go from there.
And there are definitely pictures on that website that really can help you. So, and I don't know, perhaps these phenotypes are pretty distinctive because I took one look at the picture and I was like, yeah, well, don't even
Yeah,
need to
there's
read
definitely
anymore.
like
It's clear.
there are different types, but there are common patterns because it does tend to be in like the gynoid regions. So the kind of feminine body shape of buttocks, hips, thighs, and legs. And then the arm involvement at times. The cuffing again is like I'll be like walking on the street looking at people's ankles like, oh, do you have it? Do you have it? Because the thing that we didn't touch on actually is we don't know how many people have it, but some estimates are as high as 1 in 9 women in the U.S.
That's a
So
lot. That's a lot.
we say like, and you might
Mhm.
have it because of those
Mhm.
numbers. It is a lot of people, and a lot of them do not know.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and as we discussed today, for some of us, if you don't know, it's possible that you don't progress, but others, you may progress quite rapidly. And if you know about this intervention of diet, you may be able to slow down the progression. So if you don't know, it's actually important to kind of figure this out and be able to take steps, the younger and the earlier, you can.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I'm extremely lucky that I caught it as early as I did with the help of other women who kind of said, you should maybe look into this. Because, yes, it's true. I've found a lot of improvement going keto and actually more improvement going carnivore. But there are other things that I just thought was normal. Like, yeah, sometimes I wake up tired. And it's like if I put on full compression gear, then that fatigue will actually go away pretty rapidly. Or leg aches, pain. Traveling is always a nightmare. That can be a trigger for swelling with
mhm,
me as well. So now I make sure to put
mhm,
on compression while traveling, and it helps a lot. And all of that is important for me feeling my best and being able to be productive and actually do research consistently because it's like if you don't feel good, it impacts your entire life and it's just
mhm,
sucky. And it's like I feel so much better being carnivore and being really strict with it, but there's still like further improvements that I can get if I know what I'm actually trying to address.
mhm.
So like knowledge is power, GI Joe and all that. But it's true. Like if you know what you're dealing with, you can make strategies of okay, so like I'm trying to address the swelling, I'm trying to address the hypoxia, I'm trying to address like this or that. Okay, I'll do this and this and this, and if it helps me feel better, then I'll keep doing it. If it doesn't, I won't. And
Mhm,
I think that's true for everyone, but with lipedema, it's a lot of self experimentation because
mhm.
it's just we're learning.
Yeah, yeah. All right, folks, you heard it here. I hope that this was a brand new breaking information for you that was so helpful, and that you will share this video, let anybody know, anybody. I mean, do this in a very delicate way, but anyone you think might need this information, make sure
Yeah,
they
a
get
great
this
way to
video.
start is just saying, "Oh, I found this interesting.
Hmm.
I thought you might find this interesting."
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. I will see you all next week. And don't forget to sign up for my 5-day carnivore challenge. So if you have not yet taken the plunge, you want to sign up and just, spend 5 days being super strict, try it out, see how it feels, and then decide whether you want to continue. All right. So I'll talk to you later and have a good one.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.